You guys are all programmers, so you should just stick to mechanically complex games. That's feedback we received after we launched For Gens 3, our first game, which was an automation game. And this was feedback we got from multiple people, some of which I am certain you have heard of, pretty prominent people in the indie game dev scene, and we didn't like that advice. Let me tell you, we were like any hot-headed 22-year-old would be, and we're like, oh my god, how dare they push us in this box of you're only going to be making management games for the rest of your life? Because we, coming up from For Gens 3, we learned we don't like management games. So we were like, okay, who are these guys to tell us what games we should and shouldn't make right? Let's just make whatever we want. And we tried that. And as you may know if you've been following our game dev journey for a while, that didn't go great. We started making a roguelite. We then ended up having to cancel said roguelite because suddenly, well, turns out we're not good at game feel, game design and all of that. Then we tried some other like narrative driven game, also didn't work. And then we're like, okay, maybe the guys were right and we should stick to mechanically complex games. So we went to Guild Architect, a management game that we also ended up canceling because it's like, yeah, no, we just don't like this genre. It doesn't matter how good we may be at it. We just wanted to shoot ourselves through the head with a gun in real life every single day working on that game. So that also wasn't really an option. And then ironically, we made Unicycle Pizza Time, which is, a lot of you guys even consider it a shitpost of a game that doesn't have any complex mechanics in it at all, really. And it's our best performing game by far, grossly out-earning the automation game, the strategy management game that we made. And all of this to say is that I don't know what is the ideal solution. There's pros and cons for everything, and I think at this point we've tried a whole bunch of genres as well. But I think saying that, hey look, you're a programmer, you should stick to mechanical games, or you're an artist, you should stick to roguelites or whatever, games with more visuals, isn't the best approach. Isn't really something where you really consider the person who actually has to make the games. There's a lot more nuance in that, because it's game development, of course. There's a lot more nuance in everything. So I just want to talk a bit more about that. What are some of the thoughts that I have about, hey, should I stick with that same genre? Or should I every time go and make something else? Because definitely there are a lot of benefits as well to keep making the same style of game, genre of game. Like, if it doesn't even have to be like sequels, like you just only make automation games, but games in the similar genre. Maybe it's a city builder, then it's an automation game, then it's a colony sim, whatever. I do understand the feedback that we got of like, hey, make games that you are more inherently good at, the unfair advantage we have of being a team of programmers. But I don't think it's the full story. I am gonna give you some pros as well to begin with, of why should you stick to the same genre. And this is best illustrated, I think, with a story of how I once had a conversation with the developers of the Liftoff team. They're a Belgian studio here as well, super popular, super famous game. They make like drone racing simulators, and they have like 8 games or something, even more at this point, in like their Liftoff series. They've been developing on that game for more than 10 years, or like on those games for more than 10 years, with really, really good success. And I was talking with one of the developers, and what they said is like, yeah, basically the first game was the hardest because they had to get the physics right, they had to get like all of the controls right and make it feel good. And then after that, what they did is they basically, because it's made in Unity, they made a Unity package for themselves. And they called it like the Liftoff package, where if they imported that into a new Unity project, they already had a lot of the heavy lifting done, and they just needed to import like more levels, more like different levels, different drones, like change some of the flight physics maybe a little bit, but they didn't have to keep starting over from scratch. And that is definitely by far, in my opinion, the best advantage that you can have by sticking to similar genres, by just not having to rewrite all of the code. There's this like one meme, I don't think I'm gonna find it, of like some indie developer talking about how he made like a super complex custom engine for like 2D physics and whatever. And then like some guy asked him, so that's also what your next game is gonna be, right? And he's like, no, I'm making a top-down 3D management game. It's like, so you're not reusing anything? It is definitely a trap I think a lot of game developers fall into. I think reusing code, and it's something that we've been doing as well, just not on that extreme of a scale, is something that can save you so much time and effort in the long run. If, you know, you don't have to make the entire game anymore. You can already just copy paste a lot of boilerplate and a lot of original setup from your first game, like the first one you made. And that way you can also just iterate faster on your games, because you don't have to spend a week on getting your controls implemented, on getting your sound manager implemented, on getting all of these different kind of redundant similar aspects, like your camera controller, for example, if you're doing a top-down game and you're making another top-down game. Why would you have to rewrite it from scratch when you can probably just take that code and then put it in the next game? That's something we've done as well. And that saves you a lot of time in the initial setup to figure out faster, is this game actually gonna be fun? Is this an idea that makes sense? And that's something that you should figure out sooner rather than later. And it's also just simply a time perspective as well, where you're not going to have to spend as much time on the game, most likely. If you can shave off, let's say, 20% of development, that means that you have 20% faster like reaching that release stage and actually making money. There's a higher return on investment there. This is a really good thing, honestly. But I don't think you need to stick to the same genre for it, because there's also so many asset packs that can basically do this for you. Like, assuming you're using Unity, it's like a top-down engine or Ultimate Horror FPS controller, and there's so many that take a lot of the boring stuff already out of it for you. Now, these approaches aren't ideal, because we've tried top-down engine, and whilst it's solid, there definitely are some issues with it, especially when you want to then later on extend it. Knowing your own code base is probably still going to be better, but I don't think it's a requirement where everything you do has to be basically a derivative of your previous game. So if your previous game was a top-down management game, then the next one should also be top-down like management game. I don't think that is needed. Can it help? Yes. We've still been reusing a lot of code. At the end of the day, there's a lot of code that you can reuse regardless of the genre. I think for us, like, a lot of stuff is like how we do localization, how we manage our sound, how we do our feel, and all of that. We just have our own internal package that we can just import into any new project, and a lot of the heavy lifting has been done for us already, like for our save system and whatever. Those are still things you can do regardless of genre. So I wouldn't just purely look at it from that perspective, I'm only going to be making the same style of game, because there's problems with that as well. And that brings me to the next point. If you're only going to be making derivatives of the same game, well, it's not really going to be super interesting then anymore. Like, I think generally, and this is advice that I've also heard from some other people, once again, successful game developers, is you can make sequels. Like, you have your first original game and then you make a sequel where you address, you know, all of the things you couldn't get done for that first game. But don't make like the third installment of a sequel if you can avoid it, because then you're kind of running out of new things, new innovation, or you're having to stray so far away from the original game you were making that it's not really interesting anymore. And this is assuming you're going to keep making the same style of game. And if you are like, hey, we're going to take our top-down automation game framework and keep making different top-down automation games, it's not great for innovation, and you risk into this trap of, you know, you can't make the same game 10 times in a row. And I know Call of Duty can do it, but you probably can't. Or like, you can make the game, but it's not something that you can keep making the game innovative and make people care about enough. That is the big thing as well. For like that balance between mastering one specific genre, because there's value in that as well, but that is something that I think honestly is often more suited for a publisher than for a developer. Mastering a specific genre, like how a Hooded Horse, they focus on those grand scale 4X strategy games and whatever, and not the individual studios. It can help, of course, but I don't think that is a requirement. I think what you need to bring, especially, and I'm talking about you specifically, not a big indie studio, I'm talking about you, average Joe, maybe a 1, 2, 3-man team, is innovative experiences. You're not going to outcompete a 4X game, most likely, with a big development team on it. You are an indie. You're going to have to do cool, quirky things, cool new mechanics and all of that. And if you're just going to copy, paste, save code basically that maybe worked once, you're not really going to be pushing yourself to explore those more creative things. I think something like a Unicycle Pizza Time is a really good example of, hey, let's just not think about what we are supposedly good at, code and management games and whatever, and let's just focus on making a fun game. And it paid off in our case. Maybe it doesn't always pay off, but still, I think it's part of, you know, how indie game development works at the end of the day. Taking a few risks and then figuring out something that no other game has done before. You don't want to make yet another Slay the Spire-like, because honestly, probably you're not going to be innovative enough. Yeah, there's frameworks at this point, once again, for those roguelike deck builders and whatever, but you know, you can't just slap a new team on it, like suddenly it's in space, or suddenly it's, I don't know, in the Middle Ages, and call it a day with that. You need to be more broad with it, you need to be more innovative, and if you're just going to stick to reusing those one specific genre, it's also not really going to pay off in the long run, I think. Unless you reach the point where you can just, like Call of Duty, find a genre that for some reason there is an infinite demand for basically, and just keep pumping out games every month or every 2 months because you have so much boilerplate already that you can just reskin it. Maybe if you're making adult games you can do that, but I think for the most part that is a bit harder. Because we also ran into this problem after we released Unicycle Pizza Time, which by all means was a good success for the game we made. We're like, okay, should we just lean in harder into this and from now on only make streamer bait games, only make wheelchair pizza time and then moped pizza time and tandem bicycle pizza time, whatever? Would that be the next move for our studio? And we looked into it because it on paper sounded really good, but we ran into that problem of, look, we can't really take that formula and add something more to it. We can't just slap a wheelchair in it. We tried, genuinely, believe me, we tried making wheelchair pizza time, but it just felt so forced, it felt so soulless, and we knew that this was never going to have a fighting chance because we didn't like the game and it just felt so forced. It would probably be better off just leave it for now and focus on something else that we were more invigorated in, where we had more of a fresh view, a fresh kind of style of game that we could bring to Steam. There's so many garbage games coming out every goddamn day at this point. You need to find a way to stand out, and it's not going to be by making yet another generic city builder or yet another generic 3D platformer. And that's what we realized as well. We have to keep looking for how can we actually stand out. And now when I say this thing, and this is probably something that a lot of people have commented at this point of like, oh, but you know, if you keep changing genre, and I alluded to it a little bit from the publisher thing earlier, it's like, what are you gonna do with your existing audience? And this is apparently the video where I keep bringing up stories. I get you. There's this studio that I really like, Shiro Games. They made Evoland and Evoland 2. This is back when I was a wee lad, I was like 13 years old or something. I played those games. I love them. They're some of my favorite games I ever played. And then suddenly I found out that instead of making an Evoland 3, they were like, okay, no, we're gonna make Nordkart, a Viking city builder. And I'm like, guys, I want Evoland 3. What are you gonna do? I was sad about it. I was mad about it. Okay, I wasn't really mad about it, but I was disappointed in it. And I do get that point of, okay, well, if you're going to just suddenly change every single game release you do, you're not going to have that audience carryover. I think on the other hand, I think a lot of people overestimate how much that audience carryover actually does. It's never going to be enough for like sustaining your next game, unless you're doing like some really weird early access stuff or whatever. I think generally you always want to have still a really good general marketing campaign, assuming you have no existing carryover. In the case of Shiro Games, for example, maybe some people who played Evoland, which was more of like JRPG inspired, were also interested in the Viking city builder. Maybe not. They still did the rest of the marketing as well, and their games did fine. I don't think you need to overemphasize on, oh no, I can only make more games of the same because that's what my audience expects of me. I think it's more of a thing with certain publishers, like I said, with a Hooded Horse or a Paradox or whatever, where you kind of know what styles of games that they're gonna make, or like a Playway if you want to have like the simulator games and whatever. But I don't think that you as a studio, honestly, should put too much like value into it. Yes, it can help in getting an initial boost of wish lists, but in the long run, I think it's going to be cancelled out by just making a good game that new players actually want. And at the end of the day, we need to remember that game development for a lot of studios, maybe not for you, but for a lot of like more serious studios, is still a financial endeavor. They still have people to pay, wages to pay, whatever. Not everyone is a solo developer working on this in their spare time after their development job or whatever. Finances and making profitable games are still going to be a very deciding factor. It doesn't matter how much you love your game. If nobody else loves your game, you're not going to be making games for a long time. That's the reality of it. Sometimes you're going to have to suck it up and find other games that, one, you still enjoy making, and there's actually an audience for. It doesn't matter how good you are at making pixel art point and click games. It's just not profitable enough. It doesn't make sense to keep focusing only on that specific niche of games. You're going to have to find other stuff, or you're not going to stick around for as long as you'd like, most likely. You're gonna make 2-3 games and then, well, good job. Every game made like 5K. Now you're going to have to close your doors. That's also not ideal. There's a lot of games like this, for example, that just force you basically to change genre. I think an example of this is the developers of Murky Divers. They made originally an RPG style game that just wasn't making any sense return on investment wise. So instead of having to close the studio, they're like, look, we have a certain runway, let's make another genre let's look at something that can work and let's dive into that. And look, maybe we don't love it that much, but that's at the end of the day what a professional does as well. If you're a professional game developer, you can set aside your feelings and you can work on something even if it's not your passion project, your magnum opus, your dream game, whatever it is, because you understand that, look, I want to pay my bills at the end of the day. I'm gonna have to make this game, whether I like it or not. So they made Murky Divers. I don't know if you said the name, and it was a massive success. And that once again then has allowed them to, hey, maybe keep working on future games that are more of those risks. It's something to keep in mind as well. Now, to wrap all of this up, what is my opinion? The final opinion, because I talked about a whole bunch of stuff. What is the thing that I actually care about the most? Should you stick to a single game genre like those other developers told us, or should you be more like what we're doing now basically and collecting all different game genres like the Infinity Stones? Like we've made horror, we've made or tried to make strategy games, automation games, roguelites, survivor likes, it keeps on going basically, streamer bait games. Are we gonna make a visual novel next? I don't know, but I think especially, and this is also something you need to keep in mind, you guys, you're my bros. You're kind of like me, maybe like me. You're not working in giant teams. You are in this for your first few games. That's the Bite Me Games tour. You are not a seasoned, like, veteran game developer most likely. I know, like, 0.5% of you maybe is, but I think if you're just working in those first few games, you can't reasonably force yourself to stick to a single genre. It's like the high school sweetheart basically. You're stuck in your small little town in, I don't know, Kansas or whatever, and you find this one girl and she's like a 6 out of 10, but she's the best you've ever seen. That was, for our case, Forge Industry, for example. And are you really wanting to commit to that? And then the next time you go to a city or a game jam in this case, in this analogy, and you make something different and you fall in love with that, what then? Make more games in the beginning. Do take a bit more of those risks of, look, I'm gonna make a horror game, I'm gonna make a roguelite, I'm gonna make whatever, and figure out what do you like. Something that we only figured out now in the past few months really, is that actually we are enjoying our life way more in making first-person controller games than third-person, or third-person is still alright, but especially top-down games are a lot more tricky for us, and we just don't like it that much compared to making first person. It's personal preference, but it's also something that we as developers do like, and that still matters to a certain degree as well for how good can you develop and how fast can you develop. Like I said, I think you should just keep trying out some different stuff right now. Keep focusing on making those smaller scoped games because it also just reduces your risk. Don't commit to making an RPG for 5 years when you could make just as well 5, 6, 7, 8 games in that same time. That could also be wildly different genres, and just explore what works best for you. I think that's all the advice I can really give you. It depends on so many more things, but really I strongly encourage you not to lock yourself into a single specific genre when you start game development. This is something that you will learn over time, and if you're watching this video, probably that time where you learn it still has to come. Thank you very much for watching. If you're new here, we make 2 videos every week talking about game development and things that we've been learning along the way. If that's something that interests you, head down below and subscribe, as I'll get happy and you'll get these videos delivered straight to your subscription box. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!